which
Oh,
is really,
okay.
really cool. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we can speak to David about the Georgia case and beyond.
Thanks, Tony.
So, David, um, let me ask you about this very chatty four-person in this grand jury. Now, this is not a charging grand jury. I wonder if you can speak to that, kind of explain this. But it's a bad look, isn't it, when you have this person showing up to every interview and seeming kind of out there? Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay. A lot of the commentators are former federal prosecutors like I am. And there's not only rules, but there's criminal laws on grand jury secrecy. So had that been a federal grand jury, which it was not, she would be strongly admonished not to share her thoughts like that while the investigation is going on. And it would actually be a criminal violation if somebody, let's say, leaked a grand jury transcript, which is a secret by statute. So I think a lot of people thought it was a really bad look because they just didn't really understand that this was not a federal grand jury. This was a non-charging grand jury in Georgia, and it has its own rules. So this was not a case where she was doing anything wrong or violating the law by giving the interviews that she gave. So I think that's a fair thing to say, in her behalf. She's 30 years old. She is not someone trained in the law. And something really interesting happened that she had a right to talk about. And from her point of view, Mark, she did constrain herself. I think the judge had said people shouldn't comment on deliberations and they shouldn't name names. And she didn't do either one of those. What she did say was that there were at least a dozen people they'd recommended for indictment. And of course, that's a bombshell because we hadn't had that factoid, and it's an important one, that 12 people were recommended for indictment. Now, moving to your point about the fact that it's not a charging grand jury, I think the district attorney down there was very wise in what she did. And she needed to navigate a couple of things. She can indict somebody with a regular grand jury, but apparently they cannot call people before them the way this one could. This grand jury's been sitting since June, and the power that it has is the power of compulsion. It has the power to compel people to come in and testify under oath. And the grand jury did that very ably. So they've heard under oath from Giuliani, from Senator Graham in South Carolina, I think from Mark Meadows and others. And so we call that locking somebody in. And the reason that we call that locking them in is because once they've testified under oath with a transcript and a tape before a grand jury, they can't go back on what they said unless they want to face perjury charges, because they would perjure themselves, or there'd be strong evidence they'd perjure themselves if they then said something different later on in, let's say, a trial than they had said in front of the grand jury. So that grand jury you could think of sort of as a locking in mechanism, a way to get a transcript and a tape under oath from critical people in the investigation. So it served that function. Now there's going to be a regular grand jury, which is the one that's going to consider the charges. So this idea that she somehow tainted the investigation or somehow given Trump a bunch of great motions, I think his lawyers are paid a lot of money. Remember, there was the $3 million lawyer down in Texas. I think the records show he's paid over $10 million in legal fees just this past year. And he may have found other ways to pay other people in kind or whatever he's done. He spent a fortune on criminal defense lawyers. Of course, they're going to bring these motions. But at the end of the day, what's the harm? That it's tainted the grand jury pool? If you're sitting in Atlanta, Georgia, and you're somehow tainted by this, a woman giving her interviews, but not tainted by anything else in the investigation, I mean, come on. We've only had the January 6th riots shown on TV that people have seen over and over again. They're going to find jurors who weren't tainted by that. They're going to find jurors who weren't tainted by the reporting on 4 years of incessant misconduct and law breaking by Trump. They're going to find jurors who aren't tainted by that, but they're going to be tainted by this lady saying that multiple people got recommended for indictment. And when they said, is Trump one of them? She gave that great look to the interviewer. If they're tainted by that, America is in deep trouble, and we're not in deep trouble. And so she has not tainted the grand jury pool. She has the petit jury, that is the jury for the trial. She hasn't tainted that pool. They're going to meticulously vet those people before they're allowed to sit on the jury. But I think that the big story in my mind is I don't think that the charging grand jury and Fani Willis, the DA down there in Atlanta, I don't think they're going to charge Trump in this round. I just don't see it. If there's 10 or 12 people they want to indict, I think there's a round to indict them, convict them, try to flip them, make them worried about going to prison, which they'll be a lot more worried about after they've been convicted or after they see the writing on the wall that they're going to be convicted, flip them against Trump. And the disappointing thing is that that's not going to happen before he tries to run for president in early November of next year. I don't think that an indictment of him in Georgia and a conviction of Trump in Georgia is going to happen before the next election.
Yeah, you've been really consistent in that regard all along the way. And many of us are frustrated by it, but you feel, look, that's just the truth, that there'll be those other indictments before Trump is ever indicted in this case. You've even sort of suggested, I think, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but that there are ways for him to squirm around potentially a guilty verdict should he be indicted. That is to say, even if you play that call back, that call seemed to be so damning. But I remember you in one of our conversations saying, well, yes, but they will have a defense for it, right?
Well, there's two aspects to that Georgia case, and that's the key one. It's more interesting than the alternate slates, but that's the second part of what they're investigating, that after he knew he'd lost, after everyone had told him he'd lost, after there'd been a recount in Georgia 2 or 3 different times, and they all showed that he lost, then he still has this, as part of this plan, to send alternate slates, as though he'd won the state. He's going to send people to the Capitol who are going to vote Georgia for Trump, even though all the recounts have shown that Georgia was not for Trump, it was for Biden. So he's done all of that with the alternate slates. But how clear that's going to be, it's just not as engaging as the other part of it, which is the phone call. Now, the phone call, sorry?
Go ahead. Yep.
Hello?
No, nothing. Go ahead.
The phone call that he makes is on about January 2nd or 3rd. So, of course, he has all that information that he's lost and that Georgia has been recounted against him. And yet he still makes the phone call, which is, hey, Brad, who's the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, find me another 11,000 votes. And by find me in that context, he means concoct me, because, again, they can show that he's lost. His defense, though, will be something at trial, if that's the principal charge against him in state court down there in Georgia. Well, I got advice from people that we really had won the state. They shouldn't believe the recount. There were irregularities, that these ballots weren't counted, that they had, vote harvested, and there were a lot of illegal votes against me. And I figured if all of these irregularities were going on, why couldn't the Secretary of State find the irregularities that actually helped me? Why couldn't they, if they're finding all these votes and finding all these problems? Now, of course, that's also not true. They weren't finding all these problems. This was a very clean vote. So the idea that people were recommending to Trump, his advisors, that there really were 11,000 votes for him, and that the Secretary of State ought to diligently, honestly find them, and not the way we all, I think, hear that phone call, as that you ought to corruptly concoct me 11,000 votes. Remember, there does have to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why it's very good if the prosecutor, and a prudent prosecutor will want to have this, an insider who says no. In fact, even while we were making that phone call, Trump said to me, this is a farce, but, maybe I can intimidate this guy. I'm the president. Watch me push this guy around. And it's very important to realize that Trump did not know that that phone call was being taped. It was not agreed that that phone call was going to be taped. And so it was legal, but it was a tape he didn't know about. So he said some very foolish, I think, incriminating things Trump did on that call, thinking it was just going to be, this is just between us boys, that's Republican boys, and it wasn't. It ended up being taped. And remember, he also threatens him to prosecute him. He basically threatens that.
Thank you. I was just about to ask you about that. Yeah. The thing that we, excuse me, David, I was going to say, the thing that we hear all the time is, find me 11,000.
I just want to find 11,780.
Yeah.
Which is one more than we have.
I mean, you hear those clips, but what you're talking about, I think it's so much more damning, or it's harder to elude the clear suggestion that if you don't find them, I will see to it that you'll be ruined. Now, again, he says it in this way, David, to sort of suggest, I know we won that state. He says those very words in the call. And, if you don't find this, then you could be prosecuted for the election not being straight. I should have been declared the winner. That's essentially what Trump's position was.
And his lawyer, the lawyer for the state secretary of state, is on the phone, and he says to him, you could be in trouble. So he also threatens his lawyer that his lawyer is not only giving him bad advice, but maybe is like conspiring with him. The hilarious thing, if you find it hilarious, or the really disheartening thing, I think if you look at it, from the point of view not of the impact on the country. When I say it's hilarious, I only mean in a very dark humor kind of way, is that Trump always projects. He always accuses the other guy of what he's doing. So a guy who's in a conspiracy with his lawyers, a guy who's conspiring with Eastman, in my opinion, and a judge down here in Southern California, a federal judge, said that it was more likely than not that Eastman, a lawyer, and Trump were engaged in a conspiracy together. They were breaking the law together, and that's why attorney-client privilege didn't protect those communications. I believe he's conspiring with other lawyers of his. Look at him and Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen says that Trump was conspiring with me. And I think there were a lot of other dirty lawyers who were involved. And yet when he makes the phone call, he says, you and your lawyer could be in a lot of trouble. And I think all they're doing is they're standing up. They're doing their civic duty. And I think most people think that about Raffensperger, that they might not agree with him politically, but that he and a few other Republican office holders around the country were the real hero of this story. They're the heroes and heroines of why this wasn't a successful coup, but barely missed and became an unsuccessful coup attempt by Trump. Now, of course, he's also under federal investigation for that. That case seems to be going along under Jack Clark, the special prosecutor. That seems to be going along a pace. It's going along quite a bit. Kushner and Ivanka Trump just got subpoenaed to appear in front of the federal grand jury. We saw other people were just given legal process that they have to appear, and I believe appeared already in front of that federal grand jury. That's the one that's looking into not only the insurrection on January 6th, it may also be looking into Mar-a-Lago, although that may be a separate grand jury. We're not really sure. And of course, that's a federal grand jury where secrecy is the byword. We will not be hearing from the foreperson of that grand jury, I guarantee you.
Yeah. So this guy, Jack Smith, the special counsel, also served Mike Pence with a subpoena. Pence is now pushing back on that. What happens in those situations? We saw Bannon deny a subpoena from the House committee, and then we saw him found guilty of contempt of Congress. They charged him with contempt of Congress. I've thought that I don't know. You can maybe refresh my memory on how that all worked out. I mean, pushing back on these subpoenas is something that these guys do now, and Pence is the latest.
Well, 100 or 150 years ago, if you defied a House or Senate subpoena, the sergeant at arms would put you in, custody. In those days, you probably sit back there and have a cigar, while you were in custody in the ante room that they were using to put you in custody. And potentially they could throw you in jail. I mean, that's always the punishment for contempt, criminal contempt of the House or Senate. But it really hasn't been used. So what happens is people say that they have all these constitutional rights. The House and the Senate say, oh, no, you don't. And then they have to go to the Department of Justice as a practical matter to enforce it. And so they did not charge Mark Meadows and another person, the Justice Department and Merrick Garland did not, with criminal contempt. And so to that extent, they walked. Meadows got away with it, but without any criminal consequences. Bear in mind, one of the reasons they exercised their discretion that way was that he cooperated with them with regard to the records and the emails before he refused to testify. And so they probably thought that was in mitigation. But Bannon actually did get charged. And one of the other ones, I forget the name right now, also did get criminally charged. And you remember Bannon said, this is going to be the greatest defense ever put on since Clarence Darrow, presented these great defenses. Since Johnny Cochran, he's going to put on the greatest defense. And then, of course, he put on no defense. He got convicted, and he's awaiting having to start serving his sentence unless he wins his appeal. But with Pence, it's a totally different story because Pence got subpoenaed by the federal grand jury. When you talk about the federal grand jury, this has been vetted by a federal judge. I was a law clerk to the chief judge in Washington, D.C., who actually had these special prosecutor investigations. So, of course, he's not the chief judge anymore. Unfortunately, Judge Penn has passed away. But the chief judge who's there now in Washington, D.C., is in charge of these special prosecutor cases. So these cases get litigated day in and day out. Does attorney-client privilege apply? Does Pence have a privilege because he was the vice president? Does he have an executive privilege because he sits there and is this tie-breaking vote in the Senate? Does he somehow have legislative privilege? Is he some hybrid, right? Some amphibian who's both a executive and a legislative officer? He wants to litigate that issue, and his first place to go, all of their first places to go, is in front of that chief judge in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. If they don't like the ruling, they can take it up to the U.S. Court of Appeals, which also sits in Washington, D.C., and is the court right under the U.S. Supreme Court. Usually they lose, but if they have a good argument, they can run it up there. And we were very frustrated, Mark, under Trump, that those appeals all seemed to take forever, and that Trump seemed to play them just to run out the clock. But I think the judges are more sensitive to that and will not let Pence and these other people subpoenaed run out the clock in quite the way that Trump was able to do. I think
Trump,
Pence will have to testify.
Trump's great. Oh, you do. Oh, you do. Okay. The question comes. Let's just review it again, David. I think you sort of have suggested the answer already, but John's asking, bottom line, does Attorney Katz feel that Trump will eventually be indicted? What about eventually? You said not before the election of 2024. When do you feel as though Trump will face an indictment at any point?
I think eventually he'll face an indictment in Georgia, because I think that they will flip a lot of people who will be scared about going to the Georgia penitentiary. This fellow is at Rikers Island. This one guy who didn't really cooperate, in my opinion.
You're talking about Weisselberg, his accountant?
Yeah, who was his treasurer.
Yeah.
And I thought, boy, before he went to Rikers Island, he would start remembering accurately that Trump gave him all of those instructions, that it wasn't just a frolic by Weisselberg, or it wasn't just a brainstorm by Michael Cohen, that of course it was Trump's orders and, Trump's instructions to do those things. But, even though Weisselberg, quote, cooperated, he never seemed to fully cooperate against Trump. He's sitting in Rikers Island. I don't think those people in Georgia want to go to the Rikers Island of Georgia, and they will flip on Trump. And I think for that one, the inside baseball thing is how timely will the charges be? Some of these things are going to run after 5 years. Some of the things he did early on, some of his misconduct, like what Michael Cohen is talking about with paying the porn star to the hush money, to not tell on him right before the 2016 election. A lot of that stuff, the statute of limitations is running because it's 5 years in many instances. This misconduct, this criminality with regard to the 2020 election and things he did in January, I think in 2021, they'll still be timely. So I think that he will face the music in Georgia. And of course, he'll be much more vulnerable to prosecution. I mean, just in reality, if he does not become president again, if he becomes president again, besides all the other problems the country will have, can you imagine? I'll still be commentating with you, Mark, and we'll still be talking about these supposed privileges, and you can't charge a sitting president, and all of that turmoil we had to go through legally during the first Trump presidency. I don't believe there'll be a second Trump presidency. I think if it's, let's say, Biden and Trump, right, Biden will win handily against Trump, but I'm not a political handicapper.
Right. No, that's not your thing, although you have a lot of clear takes, so I will accept the fact, and we can discuss in greater detail. And Trump has a lot of negatives now that he didn't have before. But remember, the candidates run against another candidate, and so top of ticket, you have one other choice typically in America, and it's very dependent on who else is running. I mean, Trump had a lot of negatives the first time.
It used to always be the lesser of two evils. Now with cable TV, you see people more revering certain politicians and being polarized. The way I was brought up, my parents were always saying the lesser of two evils,
That's so true. I still think it's the lesser of two evils. It's an evil system. The best you can do is the lesser of two. Hey,
the one I like is Schiff. Yeah. The one I like is Schiff. He's not a lesser of two evils. I think that he's really a great man.
I think Schiff is strong. I also, I love. I mean, I don't know that he has a chance as a presidential candidate. I haven't heard him mentioned in that regard. Katie.
No, it's
Katie
senator.
Porter,
no, it's senator. It's senator in California.
Yeah.
I would say.
Look,
I think Adam Schiff really is a great man.
None of the choices on the Democratic side to take over the Dianne Feinstein seat are lesser of two evils. Barbara Lee is, I think, a person of righteous positions and a good legislator. I also believe that Katie Porter falls into that category. And as you said, Schiff in line.
Terrific. I think this is the better. I think this is the best of the three, but I'm just throwing my hat in the ring for Schiff.
Okay. Okay. A bonus hat today.
I worked with him in the U.S. Attorney's office. We were colleagues.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Colleagues in the U.S. Attorney's office in the late 80s.
Oh, that's really, really cool.
He was high and drunk.
No, that's not where he was. Come on now. This is David Katz, the former assistant U.S. attorney. We love visiting with you on Thursdays. Thank you, David. Appreciate it very much.
Great to be with you.
David Katz, everybody. Yeah. And thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, for making it all happen. It will help to. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.